Let's hear from Dr. Kotsko. His topic is the threat to our democracy and the neoliberal crisis of legitimacy. Dr. Kotsko, can you start?
Yes, thank you for that introduction, and I'm very pleased to be joining you. Here's my paper so that you can follow along. Among left of center political commentators in the United States, there's a widespread consensus that our democracy is in danger. Between Trump's attempts to overturn the result of the 2020 election and subsequent efforts by state-level Republicans to restrict voting rights, these commentators often claim that Americans are in danger of being subjected to permanent minority rule and that only a narrow window remains to preserve American democracy from this unprecedented threat. Democratic Party leaders up to and including President Biden himself have voiced the same concerns, characterizing the present moment as a crossroads for American democracy. I share this sense of alarm at the willingness of Trump and the Republican Party to thwart and even overthrow the will of the voters, and I support the legislation that has been proposed in response. Indeed, as will become clear, I support even more radical reforms. My purpose in this paper, however, will not be to weigh in on the present controversy, but to attempt to place it in a broader historical perspective. The relevant historical context is not only missing, but actively suppressed in favor of a simplistic view that presents Trump as an unprecedented novum that has startled an innocent and unwitting nation. This ahistorical perspective is encapsulated in what has emerged as a term of art in this public discourse, our democracy. So many presuppositions are packed into this odd little phrase. It implies a special relationship between the US and democracy. After all, we are fighting for our democracy, not democratic principles in general. It also assumes that our democracy is a stable possession, a baseline condition that Trump and his cronies are threatening to disrupt. Finally, by narrowing the focus to our democracy, it ignores the broader crisis of democratic legitimacy, which is playing out in different ways in different countries and regions, but must be recognized as a global trend. If this crisis of democratic legitimacy, sometimes unhelpfully grouped together under the heading of right-wing populism or authoritarianism, is a truly global phenomenon, then it must have a global cause. And the only truly global reality is capitalism, or more specifically, the new version of capitalism that arose in the 1970s and became truly dominant after the fall of the Soviet bloc, neoliberalism. Where most accounts of neoliberalism, which is also known as the Washington Consensus, focus on economic statistics and public policy, in my book, Neoliberalism's Demons, I make the case that neoliberalism is much more than a grab bag of policy recommendations and best practices. It is a totalizing worldview that aims to shape every aspect of society, from the dizzying heights of international politics down to the individual soul. In my own terminology, it is a political theological paradigm, a complex structure that coordinates the behavior of power structures, the political element, and the values or ultimate concerns that they claim to embody, the theological element. Like any successful paradigm, neoliberalism has evolved over time while still remaining a fundamental continuity that I argue persists today, even under the conditions of so-called right-wing populism or authoritarianism. Returning to the American scene, this means that the threat to our democracy is not the arbitrary whim of one stubborn old man and those who have fallen under his spell, but is instead the outgrowth of the neoliberal paradigm that has informed the bipartisan political consensus for a generation or more. In order to flesh out this claim, I will proceed in 3 steps. First, I will give a more thorough account of the neoliberal order and its political theological presuppositions, emphasizing its ambiguous relationship to democracy. Second, I will discuss the ways that neoliberalism, starting with the Reagan Revolution, progressively reinvigorated the anti-democratic aspects of the American Constitution that had become more and more vestigial under the post-war New Deal order. Third, I will show that neoliberalism, which actively eschewed any robust democratic mandate after it was firmly established, had to rely on strategies of demonization to shore up its legitimacy, strategies that culminated in Trump's attempted insurrection. I will then conclude by considering ways to develop a truly democratic political theological paradigm that can displace and defeat the neoliberal order. What is neoliberalism? Broadly speaking, neoliberalism is a political agenda that aims to remake as many areas of life as possible on the model of market competition. It has been so successful in imposing its agenda that many of us take for granted the centrality of the market to society. If we take a step back, however, it appears strange that an institution associated with cold utility and voracious greed should be held up as an ideal. The answer that neoliberals offer is that the market is the institution that best exemplifies the ideal of freedom. Market competition is the best way to organize society in the neoliberal view, because the market is all about people coming together freely to freely choose between goods and services. By contrast, governments and labor unions are untrustworthy because they apply one-size-fits-all policies that don't respect individual freedom. In other words, the neoliberal paradigm stakes its legitimacy on the value of freedom, but it has a very strange and narrow vision of freedom. Neoliberal freedom is not the bold self-assertion of open-ended creativity, but the correct response to market signals. This means that, in effect, neoliberalism gives us just enough freedom that it can blame us for our own problems, but not enough freedom to really change our circumstances. A good example of this is the student loan crisis in the US. Young people in the US are constantly told that the only way to escape poverty in adulthood is to go to university. And so they are often willing to do whatever it takes to get a degree, including taking out huge loans. And whether they get a good job or not, in fact, whether they finish their course or not, they still have to pay back those loans. After all, they freely chose to borrow the money. In Neoliberalism's Demons, I argue that the true core of the neoliberal order isn't any particular policy like tax cuts or deregulation or privatization, but the forced choice. The forced choice is a powerful strategy of legitimation, in that it not only grounds the neoliberal order in our formal consent, but also provides a way for it to answer challenges to its legitimacy. One thing that hurts the legitimacy of the social order is if people are suffering for no good reason. For instance, a college dropout paying off their student loans decades later. When confronted with that seemingly pointless suffering, the neoliberal order can answer that the bad outcome was a risk that the individual freely took on when they accepted the loan. Respecting their freedom to fail is more important than making sure everyone enjoys a positive outcome. And neoliberalism gives us plenty of freedom to fail. In fact, it sometimes seems like it gives us nothing but that. It gives us just enough freedom that it can blame us for our own problems, but not enough freedom to really change our circumstances. More than that, the system gets us to blame ourselves for the problems, to focus on our own choices rather than asking why we only had those choices in the first place. Instead of asking why the state doesn't provide free universities, borrowers blame themselves for choosing the wrong school or the wrong field of study. And when we blame ourselves, we implicitly endorse the legitimacy of the system because we acknowledge that the outcome was justified. In some ways, this strategy is a strange one because it relies on guilt and shame rather than more positive emotions to shore up the system. But it's a powerful strategy. Even those who are aware of the forced choice are susceptible to the trap of blaming themselves rather than the system. I include myself here, and I literally wrote an entire book about the forced choice. Neoliberalism digs its way into our emotions, into our self-image in a way that is very difficult to dislodge. In Neoliberalism's Demons, I argue that one reason the trap of the forced choice is so effective, at least in Western countries, is that it taps into some of the deepest cultural patterns from Christianity. In traditional Christianity as well, we have free will, but only on the condition that we choose rightly. Anything that we choose independently of God, anything that is truly free in the sense of not being determined by someone else, is a sin. This, of course, raises the question of why God would give us freedom that can only harm us, And the largely implicit, but sometimes shockingly explicit answer is that God needs sin in the universe so that he has something to redeem. It is much more glorious and impressive to pull good out of evil than for everything to go right in the first place. Hence, some Christian theologians suggest one of God's first acts was to make sure there was a rebellious and sinful element in his creation that he could overcome. According to Augustine, when God created the angels to be his spiritual helpers, he immediately commanded them to submit to him unconditionally. Those who hesitated were branded as demons and condemned with no possibility of forgiveness, so that God would always have evil foes to overcome. Drawing an analogy from this Christian theologumenon to the neoliberal order, I see that some version of this process happens all the time. Countries that take IMF loans are forced to adopt policies that will keep them in an economically dependent position, meaning that they will fail and be forced to seek loans again. In the US, Black and other minority communities are patrolled and harassed more often by the police, meaning that the police inevitably arrest and charge more of them with crimes. Since people who have been in prison can seldom find legitimate jobs, it forces more and more people into illegal pursuits to survive, which provides the justification for sending more police into those communities, repeating the cycle. In short, the neoliberal system doesn't only force us to choose the right thing. Often, perhaps even most of the time, it forces us to choose the wrong thing. The reason for this is that it needs a steady supply of scapegoats to blame for social problems. In recognition that the system is acting like God did when he trapped the fallen angels into acting as his foes, I call this dynamic of setting people up to fail demonization. Even though certain countries, groups, and individuals are more exposed to it than others, under neoliberalism, everyone is in danger of being demonized. That is, of being presented with a forced choice in which we are forced to choose wrong. This narrow and in some ways paradoxical view of human freedom clearly puts neoliberalism at odds with democracy, which puts forth the popular will as a principle of legitimacy. And neoliberalism has often been happy to do without democratic legitimation entirely, most famously in Pinochet's Chile, which combined mass torture and disappearances with such neoliberal priorities as privatizing public pensions. Within the Western countries, by contrast, it has typically used formal democratic institutions to achieve and maintain hegemony. Indeed, in the US and the UK, neoliberal policy enjoyed robust popular mandates under Reagan and Thatcher, mandates that both used to push forward deep structural reforms that would prove very difficult to reverse. Most of the time, however, and in most Western countries, the neoliberal order has adopted a version of the forced choice in elections. The normal form this takes in the US is that voters are presented with two fundamentally similar candidates, so that voters are more or less forced to endorse some version of neoliberalism. A riskier strategy is to run a neoliberal candidate and a clearly unacceptable alternative, on the theory that voters will respond appropriately to the blackmail, no matter how unappealing they find the mainstream candidate. This strategy was tried unsuccessfully in the 2016 US election, where a strong plurality of Americans did choose correctly, but were thwarted by the Electoral College, and then more successfully in the 2017 election, where Emmanuel Macron edged out the right-wing extremist Marine Le Pen. An even more transparent strategy is that frequently seen in referenda around European Union matters in the 1990s and 2000s, which member states felt obligated to keep running over and over again until the population finally voted correctly. More recently, the EU has used economic blackmail to manipulate both referenda, as in the 2015 referendum on the Greek bailout terms, and to replace unacceptable governments, as when the technocrat Mario Monti was installed in the wake of Silvio Berlusconi in 2011. How can such anti-democratic stratagems be squared with the neoliberal value of freedom? The answer is simple. To vote against neoliberalism is to vote against freedom itself. Ideally, everyone would recognize their true self-interest and vote correctly on their own. But in our fallen world, sometimes people must be forced to be free. And in those cases, when they act out and choose wrongly, the good neoliberal subjects focus all their energy on demonizing those who voted for the incorrect candidate, or even worse, sat out the election entirely, never asking why they were presented with such an unappealing option in the first place. In retrospect, American political dorms and institutions provided almost ideal conditions for the installation and maintenance of neoliberalism. At the time Reagan was elected, the two major American parties remained incoherent. There were still liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and bipartisan cooperation was the norm. Therefore, even though Republicans failed to take control of Congress in the 1980 elections, a feat they would not achieve until the 1994 midterm elections, Reagan's resounding popular mandate prompted congressional Democrats to work together with him on his most important priorities. This meant that Reagan's neoliberal agenda was able to quickly replace the declining Fordism of the post-war era as the bipartisan political consensus. Democrats looking to roll back Reagan's reforms were marginalized, and Democratic presidential candidates have remained consistently pro-market and pro-business to this day. So profound is the Democrats' commitment to bipartisanship that Bill Clinton continued to collaborate with Republicans on major legislation even as they were in the process of impeaching him. More recently, Joe Biden eagerly sought an infrastructure bill that could gain the support of the party that regards him as an illegitimate president who stole the election. The norm of bipartisan collaboration is not merely an arbitrary preference of the political class, as disturbingly committed to it as some individual politicians seem to be. The structure of the federal government, with staggered elections that all but guarantee that neither party can hold on to unified control for long, all but mandates cross-partisan cooperation in order to get anything done at normal times. Sweeping popular mandates are rare, and the changes that get pushed through in those moments tend to be secure simply because of the difficulty of passing legislation absent such a wave. In the 20th century, arguably only Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, and Ronald Reagan were able to convert lopsided victories into significant reforms, leaving subsequent presidents to tinker within the boundaries that those transformative presidents set. Though the federal government gets the most attention, the federal structure of the country, which disperses authority among 50 states and a staggering number of autonomous municipal governments, also proved to be a natural fit for neoliberalism. Those 50 regional units and countless other smaller authorities provide a ready-made field for neoliberal competition, as states and municipalities vie for corporate investment and the jobs that come with them. The most famous such competition was Amazon's search for a new location for its headquarters. The company invited cities from around the country to put together proposals to lure the giant competition, including state-provided infrastructure and tax incentives. All this for a company that already pays effectively zero federal taxes. While the spectacle of state and local governments conspiring to bribe one of the wealthiest companies on earth was particularly unedifying, it was not at all unusual. Drawing potential employers, or failing that, tourist dollars, has arguably become the primary job of public officials below the federal level. The situation of continual competition for capital and jobs creates strong incentives against raising taxes. The ease of moving among states means that higher taxes could wind up driving away wealthier residents instead of increasing revenue. This incentive structure, combined with the requirement that state and local governments run balanced budgets, turns the states into automatic engines of austerity, as they are invariably forced to cut government spending during economic downturns, just when that spending is needed most. In the wake of the global financial crisis, for instance, the massive federal stimulus bill just barely offset state and municipal level budget cuts, resulting in only a negligible net increase in overall government spending during an economic collapse comparable to the Great Depression. Even leaving aside the fiscal distortion introduced by state-level autonomy, the huge number of powers left to states militates against any rational public policy making. State-level control over election laws, which serve no purpose other than to allow local white populations to customize the amount of discrimination Black and other minority voters will experience, has been most prominent in the news lately. But other random powers lie with the states, including many public health functions. A federal vaccine mandate requiring all US residents to get vaccinated would likely be unconstitutional, as states have authorities over such matters. Even the Centers for Disease Control rely primarily on the voluntary release of state-level public health data and voluntary compliance with its guidance, neither of which was forthcoming from many states during the pandemic. The problem of state-level autonomy was recognized during the New Deal and Fordist eras. Significant changes to the federal structure of the US would be extremely difficult to implement given the high burden for a constitutional amendment, which would require a supermajority of states to agree to the reduction of their own power. And so FDR and his successors largely worked to circumvent state autonomy through financial incentives and various federal mandates. This effort culminated in the introduction of federal revenue sharing in 1972, which significantly reduced the pressure on states and municipalities to self-finance through local tax revenue. This program was abolished under Reagan, laying the groundwork for competition for private investment and jobs that has become the norm today. I'm going to skip down a little bit. In short, one reason that neoliberalism has enjoyed such durable success in the US, despite growing popular disenchantment with neoliberal policies, is that it was able to take advantage of the anti-democratic structures built into the US Constitution. While the Fordist order had worked to mitigate the effect of those structures and approach a more truly democratic system, Reagan reversed those trends, and his Republican successors have even introduced new anti-democratic constraints, most famously the Senate filibuster, which has only emerged as an obstacle to routine legislation in 2009 amid Republican efforts to hobble the first Black president. Yet Democrats have not only passively acquiesced, but often actively supported these anti-democratic moves, which allow them to maintain the neoliberal consensus while telling their increasingly restive left flank that their hands are tied. Hence, neither the neoliberal order nor increasingly the US constitutional order can claim real democratic legitimacy. On the one hand, the combination of a Baroque system and a norm of divided government make it very difficult to hold elected officials responsible for the results or lack thereof, because outside of once-in-a-generation wave elections, it is essentially impossible for either party to implement their agenda in any straightforward way. On the other hand, the party duopoly presents the public with a binary choice in which it is still impossible to vote against neoliberalism. The electoral system serves then only to provide an increasingly implausible fig leaf of popular consent, not to give the public the means to shape public policy. In other words, the American electoral system gives people just enough power that the political and media classes can blame the people for bad outcomes, including outcomes where their will was overturned, as in Trump's inauguration, but not enough to actually challenge the situation. This triumph of neoliberal logic poses a very serious problem for the durability of the neoliberal order. Control of institutional power is not enough to maintain long-term hegemony. A political theological paradigm also needs some form of legitimacy. In the 80s and especially the 90s, the neoliberal order could paper over its legitimacy deficit by pointing to the prosperity it had created. While the economic gains were neither as great or as widely spread as the best years of the Fordist order, they were real enough and certainly marked a contrast with the economic malaise of the late 70s. Yet the early neoliberal era was already punctuated by financial crises followed by lackluster economic and job growth, prompting the coinage of the term jobless recovery in the 90s. Even when those crises were not precipitated by outright fraud, as in the savings and loan crisis and of course the global financial crisis, they called the stability and credibility of the finance-led, market-centered model of governance into question. Shouldn't the masters of the universe have been able to see, for instance, that many tech stocks pumped up to absurd valuations in the late 90s were essentially worthless? Why are they getting such outside rewards for failing at their ostensible job of rational capital allocation and inflicting the consequences on the general public? In short, the economic argument in favor of neoliberalism was far from a slam dunk, even in the best of times. Hence, the primary legitimation strategy for neoliberalism has been the negative one of finding scapegoats to blame for its failings. In other words, neoliberalism has increasingly legitimated itself through demonization. Already from the beginning, Reagan had paired his optimistic message of morning in America with a strategy of demonization. The figure of the black welfare queen who supposedly defrauded the unsuspecting white taxpayer by using her exorbitant benefits to buy steaks and expensive cars is, as I argue in Neoliberalism's Demons, closely modeled on the early modern figure of the witch. While Reagan's demonizing rhetoric was aimed at discrediting the welfare state paradigm that he sought to replace, his strategy provided a template for later neoliberals. The figures of the hardened criminal, implicitly coded as black, the illegal immigrant, imagined as non-white, and the jihadist terrorist, a religious as well as racial other, have all served as handy scapegoats for the failings of the globalized neoliberal order. All three groups are demonized in my precise sense of being morally entrapped. As I mentioned above, Black and other minority communities are over-policed and often literally entrapped into committing or confessing to crimes, setting up a lifelong cycle of criminalization that few can escape from. Undocumented migrants, for their parts, are demonized for being rational economic actors. They are, after all, responding appropriately to the economic incentives American employers have set up for them. And they play an indispensable role in the US economy. Meanwhile, though I have no desire to minimize or explain away the harm terrorism has done, terrorism is a predictable response to the kind of political humiliation and despair that America has inflicted on the Middle East and the Islamic world more generally. Indeed, the problem of terrorism and extremism has only become worse as the war on terror has ground on. One would be hard-pressed to design a more effective program for recruiting terrorists than US foreign policy in the Middle East. In all three cases, the neoliberalism system presents itself as the solution to a problem that it has itself created and often actively engineered. And while Republicans have embraced demonization with greater gusto and creativity, the broad strategy has cut across partisan lines. Reagan may have inaugurated the era of mass incarceration with the war on drugs, but Democrats such as Joe Biden and Bill and Hillary Clinton endorsed and expanded on it with the infamous crime bill. Trump may have indulged in lurid fantasies about undocumented workers' criminal activities, but it was Barack Obama who deported more people than any other president in history. And of course, the war on terror has been a bipartisan affair and remains so even now. Biden may have pulled out of Afghanistan, but he has not meaningfully scaled back the use of drone strikes. In all three cases, the response to the inevitable failure to contain crime or undocumented migration or terrorism is to spend more money generating more and more violence and destruction, creating a state apparatus that increasingly knows how to do nothing but harm. This program of demonization is not some kind of external supplement to neoliberal policy. It is not mobilizing leftover retrograde sentiment such as racism and nationalism that neoliberalism would otherwise tend to overcome. It is integral to the neoliberal logic of the forced choice and represents arguably the only durable long-term strategy of self-legitimation for the neoliberal order. Neoliberalism cannot claim to reflect the will of the people, nor can it point to much in the way of economic benefits. Indeed, neoliberal politicians have largely stopped even promising greater prosperity. But it can trip up and entrap its demons forever and ever, amen. In so doing, our neoliberal overlords may be empowering their own future executioners in the form of an increasingly radicalized military policing conflict. Recent events from the George Floyd protests to Trump's attempted insurrection have clearly shown that the police are no longer under any meaningful democratic control. And especially in the wake of Trump's big lie and many state-level Republicans' embrace of it, it is not difficult to imagine elections being overturned or invalidated when they go the wrong way. But even if neoliberalism involves in a more explicitly anti-democratic and authoritarian direction, that will represent a contingent but logical development of a system whose leaders already view themselves not so much as ruling over us, but as judging us and making sure we get what we deserve. Even if we are no longer free to vote, we will still be free to fail and free to take the blame for choices that the system has forced upon us. Where does this leave our democracy? It should be clear that while the election reform legislation proposed by the Democrats may help stave off the worst case scenario, it will take a great deal more to reinvigorate American democracy. Indeed, the first step towards American democracy may be to acknowledge that the US has historically never been a democracy. It was starting to become one in the 60s and 70s, but the neoliberal revolution has reversed most of those gains, not only by undercutting the institutional reforms, but by imposing what Michelle Alexander has characterized as a new Jim Crow. Clearly, major reform would be necessary to open up the possibility of an authentically democratic future, beginning with the repudiation and replacement of the antique constitution written by slavers and their allies. But even straightforward reforms with widespread support, such as the direct popular election of the president, are widely regarded as impossible. Few Americans understand, much less support, the existing constitutional structure, and yet we resign ourselves to it as to some obscure fate handed down by the gods. In order to rebuild democracy in America, then, we will need to do more than tinker with institutional structures. In fact, we will need to do much less politics as understood within our current system, and a lot more theology. We Americans will need to direct much of the attention we now lavish on the largely staged struggle between the two major parties within our ossified constitutional order towards the task of discovering new hopes and new values, new ways of living together. As with the best theology, our attempt to invent American democracy will need to be grounded in practice, both ethical practice and something like liturgical practice. We can practice democracy through organizing our workplaces, through taking shared responsibility for our schools and communities, through reinvigorating the rituals of public discussion and deliberation. Presumably, when the hoped-for democratic society arises, it will have its own values and practices, and we present-day theologians, mired down in the sham of American neoliberal democracy, should not presume to dictate terms to that new creation. But if we do our democratic political theology right, we will be ready to greet democracy when it comes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your provocative paper.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you very much for the stimulating conversation that we just had. And also Dr. Chia, it seems like it reminds of me when you read the American Constitution, we the people, I don't know who's the people. Are they representing real people? And People's Republic of China, they'll say they're representing the people, but I don't know whether they're really representing people. Mm-hmm. It seems like they are using this constitution as a means to manipulate these people and legitimizing their own thing. And also you brought up a very crucial concept of sovereignty of God, which is completely different from our claim to be sovereign. I think you are, and Dr. Kotsko is saying, I think you remind us to challenge any claim to be sovereign in any form, because to us as a Christian, God is the only sovereign, but his or her doing is different from our way of doing things. So I think it's both economically and politically. I really, really appreciate very much. It was very something that make us to think the fundamental level of the Constitution, the rule or regulation that we are all bounded or forced to bound it. So thank you very much, and especially thank you very much, Professor Lim, for organizing such a wonderful, actually timely conference, initiating this very crucial and relevant issue regarding the state of democracy in China, Hong Kong, Korea, actually even in America. After I've seen the Capitol quote-unquote riots, it's not something that we take granted. So thank you very much. It's just like a state of democracy all over the world, USA, Myanmar, Hong Kong, Korea, you mentioned about Afghanistan and elsewhere. And especially your talk in relation with theology and Bible, I really appreciate. And also as a dean of the College of Theology and the United Graduates of Theology at Yonsei University, I welcome all the participants from every corner of the world, especially esteemed scholar. I think as you continue to engage our conversation on the state of democracy and theological response to this subject, I'd like to say a few words on our university, Yonsei University, and because it's happening. And Yonsei University, as you probably know, in the time of the military dictatorship for almost 30 years until 87, Korea, the history of Korea, Yonsei University has been the site of resistance against the military regime and rule, and home of the student demonstration. This particular campus, this site, I'm right now, and Dr. Lim is right now, is the where 1987 democratic revolution began here and spread like a wildfire over the death of our one Yonsei University student killed during the protest, like George Floyd in America. So I'd like to show a little 50-second clip. Maybe if you could see, as Professor Chia mentioned, of the people, how people can be the means of changing. Maybe I'll show you a little bit about it. Bear with me.
'87 became the revolutionary year where Korea toppled the 30-year military dictatorship and gained independence all through the power of the people. The 20-year-old student who became the catalyst for the June democracy protests. His funeral procession became the turning point in modern Korean history that brought the dawn of a new age of democracy.
That, I think, really was the turning point in the democratic revolution in Korea.
No, there was a funeral procession of our student that led a mass demonstration. So people's power is real. And then the last segment of the scene is what had happened 2017. This whole people's movement, the candlelight movement, has brought this government down. Actually, we changed the president. So there is a power. I don't know whether people are representing sovereign power of God. I'm not quite sure about that. People can be manipulated in different ways, but still the people speaks, especially, I think God's sovereignty speaks through especially pain and suffering of the people. So I'm really with Dr. Chia's argument, and then the economically Kotsko's, and then you're talking about so many racial issues in here and there. I really, really appreciate it. I think the democracy is a struggle in its nature, and it's not something that is given to us. Democracy is gained as a result of struggle, as we have seen in Korean experience. I mean, obviously today you're facing a very different kind of challenges, and there is a calling to struggle for the. To me, it's like as Dr. Kotsko mentioned, it's like we are struggling for the post-racial democracy or post-nationalistic democracy. You know, we are here to, we are here struggling for the just economic structure for all, really. So I'm grateful for the speakers and the participants and their stimulating argument and question. I'm sure we are here a couple of sessions later on. I think we are all here in the struggle for democracy together, in the making, in each of our different contexts in a very different way. And we are all here to raise, as the speaker said, the prophetic voice in establishing justice and peace and equality of all. I hope this gathering would connect us, each of us, in solidarity and action. And I would like to end this welcoming with the quote from James Caan. And it reminds of me or our task and duty as a theologian. And he said, "I write because writing is the way I fight. teaching is the way I resist. Actually, this is from his struggle for the black rights, the fighting about against the white supremacy. And he said, doing what I can to subvert white supremacy. I mean, I guess we could substitute the word, the white supremacy, for the something else that is relevant to our situation. White democracy, one nationalism, one neoliberal economic system, or any kind of totalizing system or thought. So I'm looking forward to listen and engage a conversation for the next couple of sessions. I welcome you to the site of struggle that had realized in a political and economical way in Korea. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pang. It's your time to wrap up. Thank you so much for engaging this important topic of theology of democracy with us. We will continue our discussion in the morning, in the evening time, or in the evening time with other speakers, as you can see right now. For now, I will